Hello, welcome to the Access Collective. It's your host, Alana Lockett. Money in your pocket, fuel to your rocket, electric to your socket. I have a very special guest with us today. I have Professor John Q. Barrett, who is the leading expert on Justice Jackson. And most of you don't know because most of you haven't studied international criminal law, but Justice Jackson was can you tell me his title again?
Sure, he was, Chief of Counsel was the formal title. He was the U.S. Chief Prosecutor at Nuremberg after World War II of the main Nazi war criminals.
And why did they choose him? What was so special about this particular person?
Well, he effectively was the leading law figure in the United States, and the President of the United States, Harry Truman, thought he was that figure. Jackson had been a big power in private practice as a young lawyer, and then had gone to government and had risen up through government and been very successful as Solicitor General, arguing before the Supreme Court, as the Attorney General of the United States, and had become a U.S. Supreme Court Justice all before he was 50 years old. Okay. And so when the United States needs to send its person to the world stage after World War II to deal with this Nazi project, Truman wants a lottery pick, and Jackson is his lottery pick.
So, and you've really dug into his upbringing, his childhood, his education, his work. Why Justice Jackson?
Well, Robert Jackson is a very accessible person. Although he's been dead since 1954, he left a lot of words in writing. There is a fair amount of film and recording. But one of the things about his writing is his style is very direct and accessible and personal. He's kind of autobiographical, is the way I think of it, in everything he writes. So unlike a lot of other Supreme Court justices, his opinions aren't sort of filled with doctrine and things that sort of obstruct your seeing the judge wrestling with the real question. You meet the guy, you see the guy. And he dealt with big stuff, and he lived an interesting life that went from rural obscurity to the world stage, and dealt with issues that are still our issues: war, peace, international, domestic, civil liberties, power of government. And he wasn't a person in a pigeonhole. He wasn't, always here or always there, kind of pre-committed to presidential power or always a civil libertarian. He was a balancer. He was a case at a time, honest balancer. And I find that fits really with what everybody is. However we dress it up and kind of mask ourselves, I think that's what each of us is. We come to the next problem and we try and figure out, how am I going to tackle this, and what really is the right angle on this? And so Jackson is a bit of a role model and an interesting case study in that approach.
You mentioned that he had a lot of writings, and he did a lot of writings even outside of court in his opinions. There's one particular manuscript that he wrote about President Roosevelt. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, how he felt about President Roosevelt?
Yeah, the book, thanks to the Jackson family, was able to use this manuscript, which he was working on at the end of his life, which then was in a family cupboard for 50 years, and augmented and published it as a book. It's called That Man, An Insider's Portrait of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And it is by Jackson about FDR. And it's thus a Roosevelt biography, but it's also extremely autobiographical about Jackson, and really is inside their relationship, which was an underling and the president, a beneficiary of the president's power in the appointments. Jackson really owes his whole career to Roosevelt, and Jackson continued to sort of succeed, and so he got bigger and bigger jobs. And what's refreshing is that Jackson's writing this 10 years after Roosevelt's death, and kind of letting the chips fall where they fall. And he's trying to be very honest and objective about somebody who he knew very personally and thought about very subjectively. And interestingly, Jackson wasn't always a yes man, and he wasn't a sort of Roosevelt adoring person the way some others were. So it's balanced, and it's extremely praising of the president in some contexts, and a little bit more skeptical and critical in other contexts. For example, Jackson, a big law person, a real lawyer, says Roosevelt, who was a lawyer, actually wasn't very careful or thoughtful about legal analysis. He wanted to jump through or over legal questions and get to the right or wrong question. And Jackson would, as a lawyer in some of these situations, have to say, but, and this is a requirement, this is, and so, I think it's very balanced. It also gives a very inside, intimate portrait of the power and the charm and the selflessness of Franklin Roosevelt as a president, what it really was like trying to make policy to fight the Great Depression, what it was really like to try and bring military assistance to Great Britain when they were standing alone against Hitler. So it gives you that inside vantage point too.
Was there anything through those writings, as you said, you discovered more about Jackson through his writings about something else. Was there anything that you were surprised or made him seem more human?
Yeah, I was surprised by Jackson's honesty about his own ambition. You sort of see his climb and his trajectory. He obviously had ambition. But even beyond his resume, he sort of describes different places that sound like high jobs as dead ends. And he wanted to kind of get elsewhere. For example, he viewed being on the Supreme Court during the first years of World War II as a real dead-end job. It wasn't doing anything in the World War. And so he wanted off the court. And Roosevelt, told him to stay put and continue to develop as a judge. But Jackson's pretty honest about himself and his ambition, hunger, priorities. And a lot of people don't air themselves out that way.
Yeah, somehow being overly ambitious seems to be a negative character, so we all kind of play it cool. One of the things that you said that was really interesting about how Roosevelt wanted to jump to the answer, which as law students, we do a lot, is like we read the question and in our mind, morally, we feel like we already know what's right or wrong.
Right.
And
no, we all like results. We all want, the bottom line. And you have to sort of push back and learn that you need to actually have a defensible path to get to the bottom line. You can't just want, income redistribution or affordability or, this or that kind of civil right or equality kind of thing. What's your argument? What's your legal basis? How do you get from here to there? Because that's the only way we're going to sort of explain it to people who don't start on our side and want our result.
Right.
We have to show our work.
Also, we all have a different kind of moral compass. And so when we're reading these facts and a fact pattern, and our moral compass is leading us to an answer instead of taking our personal morals out of it and looking at the law and analyzing the facts against the law instead of jumping to a moral conclusion based on what we feel is right or wrong.
Yeah, agree.
So that's a challenge for all law students. And so I thought it was interesting that the President of the United States had the same issue. So we're in good company.
Franklin Roosevelt was a rich guy and a fancy guy and seems remote because he's been dead since 1945. But he was real and human in quite an interesting way, and Jackson makes that accessible in the way he wrote about him.
So back to Jackson and these Nuremberg trials. So prior to the Nuremberg trials, there is no international criminal law framework. Tell me, how does Jackson come about creating this framework, and why is that important?
Well, there are treaties. There are treaties about, sort of rules in warfare. When somebody raises a white flag, you don't shoot them. The Hague Conventions began to establish that at the end of the 19th century. And in the 1920s, there are treaties after World War I where nations say war is horrible, we're going to stop waging war. Nobody's going to start a war. But what was missing was any accountability process. There was no defined crime for violating those commitments. There was no prosecutor who had jurisdiction to investigate and arrest and prosecute people for violating those commitments. There was no court. There were no judges. There was no apparatus. So, it kind of is an unsettled land, really. And what they're doing after World War II with the Nuremberg trials is bringing the law to this unsettled landscape. And Nuremberg is the first international criminal court. Jackson and his counterparts are the first international criminal prosecutors. The judges have a charter that defines their jurisdiction and so forth, but they have to sort of develop procedures. They do this trial in public. I don't want to say they're winging it because a framework is established in advance, but they're working it out. It's a test flight. It's a test flight.
And my viewers don't know this, and I just found this out, but our law is based on common law, but the French, and they have like a civil law. It's based on civil law. And so you have competing ideas about how the law should be administered and how you should deal with these warlords. And you've got allied
and the Soviet Union had its own version of a civil law tradition, but of the communist variety, but a sort of codified code-based system, and a view that judicial pronouncement on the front end in charging was the result and the conviction and the basis for prosecution, as opposed to a burden of proof on the prosecutor, and the prosecutor being independent from the judiciary, and the defendant having a defense counsel who's loyal only to the defendant, and the defendant being able to put on a case, including choosing to testify or not, calling witnesses, introducing documents, like having a chance to defeat the prosecutor because the prosecutor couldn't carry the prosecutor's burden of proof. That's not the Soviet model. And so, in getting to Nuremberg, they really have to work out whose model is the way we're going to structure this. And Robert Jackson, sort of is empowered by Harry Truman to do what he thinks is right. Jackson is a Bill of Rights, American due process person. He sticks by his guns. The Soviet Union decides to stay in the alliance and do it our way. And so that's why Nuremberg, and decades later, the successors to Nuremberg, the ad hoc tribunals of the 1990s, the International Criminal Court today, are largely adversarial system American, with plenty of particular variations, but they're in that tradition. That really all goes back to Robert Jackson.
So he had to kind of bring all of these people to the table with competing ideas about how these individuals should be prosecuted.
Right. Or just shoot them.
Yeah, because the Russians wanted to just get rid of them altogether. Like, we don't even need to go to trial. They did it. We know they did it.
And early on, it was not just the Russians. Winston Churchill thought, a handful of Nazis should be dispatched immediately. Don't delay it. Don't structure it with a trial. Just, move them to some wall and shoot them.
But going through that process and the due process and having these hearings and having the Nazis give their defense and have their say really set a major groundwork. And that groundwork outlines how we see the Holocaust today.
Well, sure. It develops, because they do a real trial, it develops evidence, and the prosecutors have to persuade the judges who don't work for the prosecutors that the prosecutors have carried their burden of proof. And so, all of that, basically a year, is evidence that's the basis for the convictions, also 3 acquittals, and our understanding of what these Nazis were and what they did. These are the leaders, so it's basically what the Nazis were and what the Nazis did. That includes the aggressive war, and includes the sort of internal to Germany pre-war discrimination and subjugation and horrible treatment of enemies of the Reich, and that it includes, a planned exterminationism for the Jews of Europe, the Holocaust.
So now the Nuremberg Trials and setting up this court has set the foundation for what we have now, which is the International Criminal Court. And when we watch movies, we always see people are going to The Hague, or somebody's locked up in The Hague, and the James Bond movies.
As if it's some great, effective, worked out institution.
It looks nothing like it does in the movies, though. It's like somebody's in the snow and they're dropping down out of a helicopter and they're way, you know what I mean? But it's not like that in person at all. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful space. And I'll be able to show you that a little bit later. But what would Jackson think about the International Criminal Court?
Well, Robert Jackson died in 1954. So he's been gone a long time. And coming out of Nuremberg in the years when he was still alive, there were efforts to sort of stand up a permanent international court. But in that Cold War context, there was no international consensus. There was no sufficient number of nations to do it. It didn't happen. Jackson's prosecuting at Nuremberg was in a bit of a sweet spot where there was consensus and there was power, and holding the Nazis accountable was something that they could do in 1945, 46, 47. An international criminal court couldn't be done in the later 1940s and 1950s. Jackson would think it's a worthy endeavor. I have no doubt about that, because it's rule of law and it's an alternative to doing nothing, which is a failing, or doing brutality, which is indefensible. You know, it's a rule of law endeavor. It's plagued by all the human problems that surround any endeavor. Personalities and personal weaknesses, and lack of support, lack of resources, political enemies, bad behavior by people. You know, it's a very human institution. Jackson would think it is a worthy undertaking that can do better, and he would root for it. And he would want stronger people to do better in its work.
So that ambition that he had even for himself, he would have for this.
Oh yeah. No, he was a talent snob, and he was an honesty snob, and a seriousness snob, and a good behavior snob. So he wasn't perfect. He fell short. We all do in different places, but in the main, he lived up to his ideals and tried to conduct himself that way, as Attorney General, as a Supreme Court Justice, as a Nuremberg prosecutor. And he really cared about that in his staff. And it tells you something about a person when you see the teams they built and what the team members think of the boss. Jackson built very strong teams of very excellent people, not just talents, but like good people. And they loved him. They revered him. He was like, some people kiss up but kick down. Jackson kissed down. He revered his team and good people, and he would want the ICC to be, top-down good people. Yeah.
Do you personally feel like there are characteristics of Jackson that resonate with you?
On my good days, I'm in the realm of his activities, and so I try and think carefully, write well, teach effectively, and try and pay attention to problems that matter more. I find him inspiring.
So something a little bit more lighthearted. There's a movie out called Nuremberg, which I told you that I watched, and you were like, there are things that are inaccurate. Can you tell me about some of those historical inaccuracies?
It's a Hollywood movie, and it's about the prison psychiatrist, Dr. Douglas Kelly, and his interviews with the prisoners, including Hermann Goering, who was the lead defendant at Nuremberg, Hitler's former number 2. And it's based on a very fine book by Jack L. High called The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, which is about Kelly and Goering. And Kelly and Goering is basically a 1945 pre-trial story. And Kelly then took his notes home and wrote a book called 22 Cells at Nuremberg, and it's a psychiatrist's analysis of all these prisoners who he interviewed. And that's all great, and that's all solid. Unfortunately, the movie sort of also went forward to be a Nuremberg trial movie, and so it invented Doug Kelly as being present during the trial, which he wasn't.
Okay.
And it invented Doug Kelly being, sort of an advisor and interacting with Robert Jackson about trial issues and events, like Jackson's cross-examination of Hermann Goering, which didn't happen. And it depicts Jackson's cross-examination of Goering, which was a 2.5-day examination, is like a 15-minute train wreck in which Jackson is sort of paralyzed and, almost collapses and needs to be rescued by the British prosecutor. Didn't happen. And so, it's a good thing to study Nuremberg, and it's a good thing to have fine acting. The movie has plenty of fine acting, and the actors are not to be blamed for the script. But the script didn't have the guts to stick to the history.
Do you think the family of Jackson or Kelly would be disappointed with the betrayal?
I don't know.
I'm asking.
I don't have any knowledge.
We're gossiping now.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, I would guess to some extent. I mean, Doug Kelly turned out to be a tortured person, an unhappy life. He committed suicide some years after Nuremberg. His son and family papers are the basis of Jack L. Hyde's book, which is the basis of the front half of the movie. And so, the son cooperated with the book. The book became the front half of the movie. I hope the son is happy with the portrayal of his father, who was both a very skilled doctor, but in the end, a sadly, deeply troubled person. Jackson, he's a historical figure. He's a statesman. Is George Washington's family happy, or is Alexander Hamilton's family happy with, at some point, these people don't belong to the family, they belong to history. And people take takes on them that are better and worse, grounded in research or not. The movie shows Jackson as a drinker. He was basically a teetotaler. It shows Jackson living in, like a downtown Washington building. He didn't live in the Commerce Department. There are things that are just weird. But that's artistry.
I imagine it was frustrating for you to watch. Were you yelling at the screen like, that
no,
never happened?
No, I was, I was asked to contribute to publicity supporting the movie, and I declined to do that because I am a fact guy and a historian and a biographer. But
they should have called you first. Before they even produced the movie.
Different folks have different projects.
Well, I really appreciate you for taking the time. Is there anything that you would like to leave with law students or viewers that maybe you or Justice Jackson has contributed that, or just a word that you think would be good to leave us with?
Well, I think, yes, what I really think my work is across all the different things I do, teaching constitutional law, working as a biographer, is studying choices. I mean, law is a real thing, but law is a human creation, and it is a chosen approach to a particular problem. A constitution is a choice, a statute is a choice, an interpretation is a choice. And these are all human activities, and sort of seeing the choices behind the formal materials is a deeper way to think about where we are, and frankly to think about yourself, because tomorrow you're going to be making choices. Yeah. So don't skip the law, but don't only get stuck in the formality of the law. See the choosing of this versus that approach.
That kind of high level picture without losing sight of the details.
Yeah. See the people.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
I appreciate
Alana.
you.
I've enjoyed this.
Bye.